because the fact that the Trump administration imposed a lot of tariffs and then hit pause, that has affected how people in the United States are interpreting this. It's not necessarily the concern where everyone fears immediate price increases. There's actually a level of relief, particularly among the business community, where a lot of these tariffs are not going to be going into effect, at least immediately, potentially in the same way. And that is something that to some is definitely a relief.
Ari Hawkins, thank you so much for talking to me. This is not a trade deal in the traditional sense, is it? Just explain what is going on.
That's right. This is more of a framework for an eventual deal, which is how it's been spoken about by White House officials to us. It's a roadmap, effectively, for future negotiations and to ensure that a separate deal in Geneva is actually upheld to, rather than necessarily a step forward in negotiations between the US and China. This is to make sure that a prior deal maintains the type of dynamic that both China and the US want.
So what is the Geneva deal that we're talking about?
The deal that Trump administration officials, including U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, made in Geneva, was to make sure that tariff levels went back to a state that was viable for trade between the U.S. and China. That was where they slashed tariffs that were in the triple digits on both the U.S. side and the Chinese side, down to a much more manageable level to really kind of get the ball moving forward. Again, tariffs on both sides still are maintained, and that's something that both sides want desperately to negate through further discussions. But this Geneva agreement that has now been reinforced by the most recent discussion is really aimed at mitigating those sky-high tariffs.
Well, let's talk about the tariffs that are still on, because from a British perspective, there seem to be three tranches of tariffs that Trump has brought in. One is the sort of anti-fentanyl tariffs that he's brought in on China particularly, but also Canada and Mexico. Then he had the industry-specific tariffs on things like steel or car imports to the United States. Then he also had his Liberation Day tariffs. He now says there'll be 55% tariffs from the US on Chinese goods. Are those the fentanyl-related ones? Are they separate to the industry-specific ones? Which ones are still in place?
It's a little bit of a mix and match. The 55% is from both the 30% rate, that was the agreement that was reached in Geneva. That Geneva agreement was what made those tariffs at 30%. In addition to the worldwide 10% baseline reciprocal tariffs. And as well, there are the 20% fentanyl tariffs. And these all are sort of being put together here. Again, there was also, during the first Trump administration, 25% tariffs that had already been in effect. Those are still in effect, both kept by the Biden administration as well as the second Trump administration. So again, this is the pre-existing tariffs from the first Trump administration, as well as tariffs imposed because of fentanyl, as well as the 10% universal tariff that was imposed on most or all countries.
So obviously, Trump and his team are selling this as a win, a US deal with China. But this is not leaving the US in a better off position than, say, before January the 20th, 2025, is it?
Tariffs are much higher in Trump's second administration than they were at any point prior to the onset of that. That hasn't changed. The Trump administration has obviously made tariffs a cornerstone of its economic agenda, and that is set to continue for the entirety of the second administration. But this is not a deal in that it lowers tariffs below what they were prior. The Chinese side did agree to restart the flow of critical minerals to the U.S. That was a major achievement that the Trump administration was touting, and that is something that will positively affect a large number of industry groups. However, at the same time, this is not a traditional agreement. it's not comprehensive, and it hasn't actually even been agreed to by both President Donald Trump or Chinese leader Xi Jinping.
Well, it seems like there's still quite a lot riding on it in that case. How much does Trump want a full fat trade deal with China? It seems to me there's a difference between, say, his approach to the UK, where he puts tariffs on, but ultimately the US sees the UK as a long-term ally and trading partner, and he's trying to get better terms for the United States in that relationship. Whereas he's very much spoken about China as an adversary on the world stage. That doesn't seem like something you can get over with a trade deal.
That's a really good point. The Trump administration, ever since its first term, has changed the bipartisan perspective on China. They have ratcheted up tariffs to an unprecedented degree, and that mentality has been adopted by Democrats in office, as well as former President Joe Biden, who kept on most of Trump's tariffs. All of what that means is that the Trump administration hasn't necessarily changed on its approach to China. That has been pretty persistent. But the focus on particularly the most extreme tariffs, that's been something that is pretty unique to just the Trump administration. That's something that we've seen perpetuated throughout this and is poised to continue. The Trump administration cares about the market, however, primarily. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is the individual who appears to be the one that is able to very effectively calm the markets when there are these sort of sudden kind of hikes that would send certain things spiraling. He's someone that is able to get those back down to the degree that the Trump administration would like. And that, more than the relationship with China, is what the Trump administration does keep in mind. Again, yes, he loves tariffs for what they are. That is something that he has perpetuated throughout his campaign when he was during the 2024 election and also up until now. However, he does deem that tariffs are a revenue raiser, and that translates to how he operates in a lot of these degrees.
And just finally then, Ari, what has been the reaction on Wall Street and in Washington, and then if we have any indication, among the public?
So Wall Street has gotten accustomed to the fact that the Trump administration does propose a lot of tariffs. There are certain aspects of that where the market no longer really deems it as a serious threat when there are certain tariffs that are floated. However, at the same time, the Trump administration already has imposed a ton of tariffs, and many of which have maintained and remain in effect today, meaning that the market is reacting to that. There has been a negative reaction towards an increase in tariffs, as there very often is. So that's something that is going to be reflected. However, again, the market has dynamically shifted since the start of Trump's second term and has gotten accustomed to those sudden shifts. It doesn't necessarily register threats of tariffs the same way. There's a little bit of a period of it adjusting to whether or not that threat is serious, and then it will adjust accordingly. In terms of the public, I think that because the fact that the Trump administration imposed a lot of tariffs and then hit pause, that has affected how people in the United States are interpreting this. It's not necessarily the concern where everyone fears immediate price increases. There's actually a level of relief, particularly among the business community, where a lot of these tariffs are not going to be going into effect, at least immediately, potentially in the same way. And that is something that to some is definitely a relief. And it is an interesting sort of interpretation of how the political stage has shifted. Tariffs in the second Trump administration are much higher than they were prior to the election of Donald Trump the second time. However, that aspect is not really talked about quite as much among the public. What's talked about much more often is the fact that all of these tariffs now are potentially not going into effect the same way.
Ari Hawkins, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.